I went to school in Newcastle where I played rugby league, and I only played rugby union when I went to Sydney University because that's all they played. I did a year of science and 6 years of medicine and a year after, so I played rugby with Sydney University for 8 years, in which we won 4 premierships, I think. I coached them for 3 years, won another couple of premierships. Well, I'd never coached before, so I didn't know what to do or how to do it, so I said, well, we'll start right from the basics. I think learning the basics of rugby is a little bit like learning the basics of a bricklayer. If you can't lay the bricks, you can't build a decent house on top of it. So once you've got all the fundamentals right, then you can start playing with a few fancy moves. And that's what we did, and it worked pretty well.
Sydney University went very well in those years. In 1960, I played in the second grade. We won the premiership in that year. Then I was coached by Dick Tooth first, really a great coach in terms of the basics of the game. He coached 61, 62, 63. Well, no, it's quite interesting because Sydney University had line-out signals, right? Basically, this was developed by Dick Tooth. The Australian Rugby Union team didn't seem to have that. So there was Jeff Chapman and Peter Criddle and John O'Gorman. We were all familiar with the line-out signal, so quite something that Sydney University brought to that team. And that spirit, there is nothing like a belief that you can win the game. I think Sydney University players actually brought that into the Australian team.
Sydney University's post-war golden era began with a first-grade premiership in 1951 under coach Donald Joe Kreft, a veteran of the 47-48 Wallaby Tour to the British Isles.
A bloke called Joe Kreft was coaching. Prior to that it had been Harold Masters, who was actually an ex-All Black, but he wasn't a very good coach. So I think coaching had a lot to do with it. We've always had fairly good players. In 1951, when we won the premiership, we had Ronnie Jacobs, who was an ex-Maori All Black, was half. I was 5'8". Keith Constable was inside centre. So we had almost an international back line in those days.
Barney Walsh took over as coach in 1953 and had instant success, winning a hat-trick of premierships from 53 to 55.
People like Barney Walsh and Jim Maunsell, they were enthusiastic, they drove us. But the senior players, to me, 4 years older, people like Solomon and Tooth, they were much more aware of tactics, the way teams should play. And I always felt that they were much more interesting to listen to than perhaps some of the defined coaches, as it were. I mustn't ever forget John Thornett and Rod Phelps, and they were at Sydney University for a while, but their contributions to Australian rugby I thought were profound.
Though Thornett later switched to northern suburbs, it was his Sydney Uni rugby days that kept him in the game. In 1956, he opted for the Australian Universities Rugby Tour of Japan over the chance to play water polo at the Olympics. And it was Dick Tooth who captained that Australian Universities Tour of Japan in 56.
And looking at a picture of the Emperor, who was then the Prince. We were the first sporting team to go there after the war, so we really got feted and looked after, and they were pretty good. We won all the games, but they played well, and we got a lot of bad press from the guys who'd been tortured by Japanese during the Second World War. They were dead against the tour going ahead at all. And the people we were involved with were like us. We hadn't been involved in the war, so we just got on like ordinary people.
It was interesting to see people come into the club, mature. The senior players, Solomon, Tooth and Brockhoff, they went on to coaching, but their contribution to Sydney University rugby, New South Wales and Australian rugby was fantastic.
John Solomon's Wallaby career began with the historic 1949 season, which included a match in the first ever Bledisloe Series win by Australia. Solomon was joined in the national side by Dick Tooth in the home series against New Zealand in 1951. The following year, Solomon was appointed captain of Australia against the first ever visiting Fijian side. The Fijians were a big hit with Australian fans and were invited back 2 years later in 1954. Dick Tooth was in the Australian team.
The thing that I remember most about the Fijians was a big winger they had called Joe Lavula, who was a very spectacular winger, and I was playing fullback and I had to tackle him a couple of times, and it was a pretty physical kind of encounter, I can tell you.
The Australian team are presented to Governor-General Sir Wallaby Norrie before their rugby test with the New Zealand All Blacks at Wellington.
Solomon returned to captain Australia one last time on the 1955 tour of New Zealand. Dick Tooth was also on this tour and 2 years later captained Australia against the visiting All Blacks ahead of the tour to the British Isles. But in one of rugby's great controversies, Tooth was a shock omission from the touring party.
After the second test up in Brisbane, I had a bit of a falling out with one of the selectors. It was straight after that the team was picked and I wasn't in it. Big tour of England, the one that I missed out on, they only had one every 10 years. So, to be able to take part in that kind of tour was just a big ambition that everybody had.
We went to Buckingham Palace. It was the Duke of Gloucester that shook hands with us at Twickenham, and the Duke of Gloucester's hand was very limp. You never got the impression that he was very fond of shaking hands with anybody. But on the bus, we enjoyed ourselves. There were Springbok songs, there were All Black songs, there were even a couple of French songs.
Money wasn't part of rugby in those days. When we went on a Wallaby tour, we got paid, I've forgotten what it was, £2 a day or something. That was the total cost. We didn't have to buy much because in New Zealand, when you're playing rugby, you get very well looked after. Oh, you meet a lot of people, you remember a lot of people, and even if you see them 10 years later, you say, oh yeah, I remember the time when we did this or that. Well, I did medicine and graduated, got more and more involved in things like knee reconstructions and shoulders, because having played with a lot of these fellas, they came to me when they had their problems. So I was an orthopaedic surgeon specialising in knee surgery.